Hello, welcome back to the Intro to Python Programming for ArcGIS Pro. This week, this chapter, we're looking at adding another level of complexity to our scripts through the use of functions and bringing in more information on more complex or more complicated types of variables called objects. The first video for this week, for this chapter, is looking at functions. So what we have seen before, in chapter 2, we saw simple statements. In chapter 3, we added a level of complexity with complex statements, or control statements, if then, or loops. Now we are moving up again to adding more complexity through functions, which, if we bring in the analogy with writing and simple statements or the basic sentences, and you have more complex sentences with conjunctions and so on to be kind of analogous to our control statements, we now can build upon that and have what kind of amounts to paragraphs. So functions, these paragraphs, are chunks of code, almost always more than one statement. They can technically be a statement, but there's not much point in having one that small. So kind of like paragraphs, chunks of code that we can reuse. That's in a large part where their value comes in, or part of their value is a series of code that you may want to do many times and may appear in different parts of your script. Instead of having to type it over and over and over again, you just create a function. Furthermore, if you were to type it over and over and over again and you realize there's a bug, you might not remember to track down all of the places you put that code to fix the bug every single time. If you have it in a function, then it's all in one place. And so you only need to fix it once inside the function. So okay, enough of the overview. What are functions? So as I said, they're groups of statements. So I might have here I might perhaps start out with a control statement. Perhaps following that up with a loop. And finish with a couple more statements and something called a return statement. I'll get back to the return statement later. So I take those statements and I put them in a folder here. And once I have that folder, I can say, here is my function. And I name that folder, my function. Having done so, anytime I refer to my function, the computer knows to go through and in turn run that conditional statement followed by the for loop followed by the end of the function. So we have these statements, and they're in a nice, convenient package for us to use every time I say my function. And that's the essence of functions. They are these pre-packaged sets of statements, sets of commands that we can reuse over and over. Now, there are two parts, in a sense, two aspects of functions where that, you could say the analogy with the paragraph sort of breaks down, which are the inputs and outputs. So not only can a function be this collection of code, but also it is a process, in a sense, a processing mechanism, where you give it inputs, it does something with those inputs, and it gives you an output. Both the inputs and the outputs are optional in how functions work within Python. So moving on to Python. We have our inputs and our output. I'll leave that up here on the board. As with the control statements, setting up a function starts with a specific keyword, in this case def, for define my function. And we give it the name. So here we can see that variables and functions are the two main kinds of named things within Python that we create. So we have my function here that we're defining. The main distinction, and something that is part of that syntax pattern for defining a function, is we always follow up with parentheses, and as with the if, the for, the while, we end with the colon. These parentheses the inputs are what go inside those parentheses. If there are no inputs, then we still have the parentheses, there's just nothing between them. We've actually seen that in a couple of the functions in previous chapters. So I'll put in a couple input parameters here, A and B. So this function that we are creating now requires two pieces of information that we give to it, A and B. If you don't give it two pieces of information, if you don't give it two input parameters, it's going to complain and you'll get an error message. Following the folder that I had, I started out with an if statement, and you'll notice I have this if indented one level. As with the control statements, how Python recognizes what is inside the function versus what is not in the function is based upon indentation. So now that I have an if statement inside the function, I just add another tab, another level of indentation for what I do if this clause is true. So I might say if A is greater than B, do something else, do whatever it is you want to do if A is not greater than B. I then had a for loop which needs to be indented to be inside the function. And I finished with return x. So just to fill in here, to make this very simple, I might assign x to A if A is greater, or to B otherwise. So x gets the greater of those two numbers. And I do something else in a for loop, return x. X then becomes the output. So this defines my function. It is creating this folder. What it does not do, this is an important piece of information, what it does not do is tell the computer to open the folder. It does not tell the computer to actually carry out anything inside this folder. To actually run my function, to actually do something with this, I actually have to call my function 4, 5, giving it the same number of parameters as it's expecting. So now A is equal to 4, B is equal to 5. Typically, especially with the return value, I would set that to something. So set that to a variable. So I'm creating a box here with the label G, and G is going to get the contents of this box is going to be whatever happens when I run this function. Given what is here, it's going to end up being 5. So I run that, I get 5, and I put it in to my variable G. So that is a quick overview of how functions work within Python. The main things here are that they are collections of code that you can reuse. So every single time you call my function is going to do this. So you don't have to type this whole sequence of statements over and over again. Setting it up requires the keyword def, then the name of the function, and then a tuple of parameters. And A and B, here's what I have as A and B. It takes in 2 parameters. It does something with them, typically, in those statements, and gives a return value at the end. Both the input parameters are optional. I don't have to have anything there. It could just be an empty set of parentheses. I also do not need to return anything. Although if you do, it should be at the end. that sets up the function. To actually execute the function, you have to call it. You have to then say, my function with actual values. These values could be taken either as raw numbers like I have here, or the values of variables. Either will work. So that is the overview of functions. So I hope you all have a great day, and I will see you at the next video, which will look at objects.